Welcome. It would appear that the latest victim of the culture wars is God himself. That's right. Just recently, a Utah school district announced that the King James Bible is going to be banned from elementary and junior high schools. A little bit of background here. When I was growing up, the question of banning books was very much a live issue that was debated endlessly. And I remember when I was young, when I was growing up in the 80s and into the 90s, a lot of the impetus for banning certain books came from conservatives, from religious conservatives. And at that time, there were still progressives who argued the point on principle, shocking, I know, that books should not be banned. Do any of you remember when libraries used to have a Freedom to Read week? They would actually take all the books that had been banned, Huckleberry Finn, Rushdie's Satanic Verses, Howard Stern's Private Parts, all the books that were banned would be proudly and boldly displayed front and center at the library under the title, Celebrate Your Freedom to Read. Yeah, I believe there are still some libraries that do this occasionally, but it's not as robust as it was, say, 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Now, if you fast forward to more recent times, a lot of the calls for banning books in recent years have come from the woke left, getting rid of books by whether it's Roald Dahl or Dr. Seuss or other authors, any books that have something that's a little bit politically incorrect, that present racial stereotypes or anything that's simply not multicultural enough, have been banned. And how has the right responded to this? Well, the right has responded by saying, okay, well, then we're going to ban books on gay and trans themes for young people. We're going to ban books that teach critical race theory. Of course, there's a lot of problems with the way those subjects can be taught to young people, but that's separate from the actual question of banning books as such. Now, the particular law that we're concerned with here was passed by a Republican, and it's called the Sensitive Materials in Schools Act. Think about that for a moment. Sensitive materials in schools. Be careful how you touch that book. That book is sensitive. It doesn't want to be touched the wrong way. Seriously, people, it's not books that are sensitive. It's readers that are sensitive. Is it any wonder that people who advocate the banning of books don't know how to use the language properly? And so a consequence of this law in a certain Utah school district for banning books is that one particular family complained that the Bible contains violence and vulgarity. Violence and vulgarity. So this group of people who are tasked with administering this law read the King James Bible and concluded, yes, it's not appropriate for certain age groups, certain grades, so we'll take it out of the schools. We'll take it out of the elementary schools, the junior high schools, even though it's actually not a permanent part of the curriculum. We'll take it out of the schools. We'll take it out of the school libraries. And so far, there have been very few protests. So for me, this is really a barometer of how far civilization has fallen in my lifetime. A few decades ago, if somebody proposed banning books, what was the response? Keep your stinking paws off my sensitive materials, you damn dirty apes. Nowadays, the response is, you see what these people are doing? They're trying to ban books. Let's ban even more books. End of rant. James, how's it going?
I'm well. How are you? That was brilliant. Yeah. Normally, the Bible isn't part of the public school curriculum, especially in elementary school and junior high school. It's generally only taught as literature or philosophy in high school, if it is ever taught in public schools in the United States. But as you point out, this Utah law, which was written and passed by the Mormon state of Utah, wanted to restrict sexually explicit material, LGBTQ type material. And, you can understand a parent's desire to not want their elementary school kid exposed to certain sexually explicit material. But of course, this is the inherent problem with public education. Public education must present values, must have a philosophy. Under the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, the government cannot establish an official religion of any kind. This is meant, according to the Supreme Court, that school teachers, for example, can't lead the class in a prayer, and things like that. Well, how do you teach history, though, without any sense of values? How do you teach literature without any philosophy underpinning it? I mean, honestly, how do you even approach Shakespeare's Othello or Sophocles' Antigone, some of the great moments in Western literature? How do you teach that in a value-neutral way? You cannot. You can't teach history. Just what you decide to present in history is going to be filtered through a set of values. There's going to be a philosophy. I don't think you can teach mathematics without an implied philosophy. There is no way that you can educate a child without having to stumble across these issues. Someone's going to be offended whether you include the Bible or exclude the Bible. Someone's going to be offended if you teach evolution and not teach evolution. Someone's going to be offended if you have a prayer or you don't have a prayer. That's why public education is inherently wrong on the face of it. It's wrong on many levels, but just first cut, it's a violation. The government is establishing, in effect, an official philosophy. Okay, that being said, public education is inherently corrupt. On the other hand, banning books is scary to me, or even worse, like altering books by Dr. Seuss or Roald Dahl. I happen to have grown up with the books of Roald Dahl and Dr. Seuss, and frankly, Dr. Seuss, the Sneetches, the ones with the stars on theirs and the ones without the stars on theirs, is all about bigotry. I, as a child, was learning how not to be a bigot. And if some picture that seems to be offensive in some way, in some subtle way, it's almost as though they're putting the spotlight on it in a way that there never was previously to Dr. Seuss. But in any event, you make a decision. Either you use Dr. Seuss to teach reading, or you don't. And I don't see anything offensive with Dr. Seuss. I do see something wrong, though, with people whose knee-jerk response is to take a book out of a library. Ideas as such, words as such, are not to be feared. All things being equal, there is no book that is so frightening. I mean, words are not violence. Words are not force. Words cannot hurt people in the same way that a criminal or a gangster or a child molester can. There's a total difference that people need to understand between the content of a book and force. So that also being said, I have to say that it was sort of a brilliant move on the part of this family. One school district has, in fact, banned the Bible in Utah under this law. And if you look at the Bible, if you look at the law, first of all, it can't be pornographic as defined under Utah state law. And that means dominantly appealing to a sexual prurient interest. And the Bible, of course, is filled with verbal pornography that makes 50 Shades of Grey look, like a children's book, really.
Does the Bible really appeal to prurient interest? I mean, was that really the intent?
May I just well, there are sections which are clearly designed to appeal to prurient interest. For example, famously, the Song of Solomon.
Song of Solomon, yeah.
Hebrew Tanakh. There are some religious people who try to say, well, it's a love poem to God. Well, if it's a love poem to God, God has a great rack. That's all you can say. The focus on Song of Solomon is on the beautiful breasts and so forth, and on real live sexual. It's not just a metaphor, let me put it this way. If it is a metaphor, it's a directly sexual metaphor. In my view, that's a lot better than the New Testament, which is anti-sex. The New Testament advocates celibacy. Jesus has to be born of a virgin. Eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake are a good thing, Jesus says, and so forth. The physical is put down in the New Testament. Sex is bad and dirty in the New Testament. Whereas in the Hebrew Bible, in the Tanakh, you can find something like Song of Solomon, which is outright praise of sexuality. But let me read one section from the prophet Ezekiel. It can be found in Ezekiel 23. Starting at verse 18, when she carried on her prostitution openly and exposed her naked body, I turned away from her in disgust, just as I had turned away from her sister. Now, this is a metaphor. These two sisters, they represent Samaria and Jerusalem metaphorically. Very interesting, isn't it? Yet she became more and more promiscuous as she recalled the days of her youth when she was a prostitute in Egypt. There she lusted after her lovers, whose genitals were like those of donkeys, and whose emission was like that of horses. So you longed for the lewdness of your youth, when in Egypt your bosom was caressed, and your young breasts fondled. Now, it's negative in this case, as opposed to Song of Solomon, but it is directly talking in an explicit way about sex. I mean, where is the head of Ezekiel when he's talking about genitals, donkey genitals, and fondling young breasts?
Woohoo!
Yeah. So I would say that by typical standards, if that were found in a item of literature, a novel, 50 Shades of Grey or something, it would be regarded as pornographic. Now, the school district in question here found that they did ban it from the libraries because the King James Version was in a couple of their libraries, and so out from the libraries it goes. But they didn't necessarily come down saying it is a violation of the state law. What they did say, though, is what it would be inappropriate for children. So they kind of had a compromise conclusion on that in this Utah case.
Yeah, and they're not taking it out of the high schools.
No,
The high school
only grammar schools and junior high schools. And you could understand why someone would even think the Bible. Now, that's just the sex part in the Bible. The Bible is filled with all manner. I mean, if you think about it, if a book were to advocate slavery today, how would the left react? How would the right react? How would people react if there was a book that said slavery is good, we should have slavery, slavery is appropriate, slaves obey your masters? Now, the Bible is filled with endorsements of slavery.
and genocide.
And multiple genocides. The Amalekites, for example, God commanded the first king of Israel, Saul, to wipe out the Amalekites. And by wipe out, he said, women, children, babies, slaves, livestock. I want all the livestock and all the babies and all the slaves and all the women killed. Now, Saul went out and killed the Amalekites and wiped them out. The women, the children, the babies, the slaves. He spared some of the livestock. For that sin, God removed him as king of Israel and replaced him with King David, because he didn't complete the genocide as thoroughly as God had commanded. The prophet Samuel approaches King Saul and he says, "What's that? I hear the tinkling of bells on livestock." I'm afraid you're toast, King Saul. And so Samuel goes out and anoints David king of Israel. The violence is quite explicit. The politics is horrific in terms of advocating slavery. Can you imagine today, under the Torah, of course, mere blasphemies against God? If you say out loud the name of God, the appropriate punishment was to be stoned to death. If you committed any sexual crime, for example, homosexuality, you name it, again, the typical penalty is stoned to death for that kind of thing. Now, do I think that's appropriate for children? No, I don't think it's appropriate for anyone. I think it's monstrous. I think the Bible is filled with monstrous ideas, monstrous stories, horrific violence, sexually explicit stuff that obviously I don't think is appropriate for young children. And if you were to compare it to other books, surely compared to Dr. Seuss or Roald Dahl, the Bible is many, many times worse, in my view.
But there's something else. There's something else to consider. I mean, aside from the question of age appropriateness, the whole Judeo-Christian tradition really is a pillar of, whether you like it or not, it really is a pillar of Western civilization, in the sense that the ideas of the Judeo-Christian tradition have shaped history of the past 2,000 or more years. I would say quite a large percentage of the greatest literature, visual art, music has been inspired by the stories, the myths of the Old Testament, the New Testament. So how can any educated adult not know at least something about the Bible? Now, I didn't have any kind of religious upbringing, neither at home nor at school. I never read the Bible. As an adult, I've taught myself about Christianity and the Bible, just partly because as a musicologist and as a historian, it's necessary to have that sort of background. But just as an educated adult, to be able to appreciate all the glories of Western civilization, it is necessary to know something about the ideas and something about the stories that have shaped the history of the past 2,000 years. So do we really want to deprive future generations of these kinds of educational experiences, the good and the bad?
Exactly. I mean, to take a book out of a library, let me put it this way. If I were running the library, the Bible is an important part. As you observe, you can't understand history without understanding the influence the Bible has had on world history. And just simply to understand art or literature, politics, the development of philosophy. Now, as history, the Bible isn't reliable. It's very dubious history, and we know that now from scientific analysis of history. We know the Bible is very poor history. And as I say, it contains all kinds of dubious philosophy as well. But that's simply a fact of history, that dubious philosophy, and even that dubious history, that pseudo history that influenced people and how it influenced people. And for example, why Charles Darwin was resisted. People were holding on to a biblical view that was different than his view of natural selection, evolution of life, very different. And so you don't ban the book from a library. Let me put it that way. It's essential to an educated person really can't be educated if they're not familiar with the Bible, as you point out, whatever their background is. The truth, though, is I think you should also have some familiarity with Judaism and Buddhism and Islam in order to understand world history, just to understand world history. And the Bible, you're right. I mean, how much great art and literature, whether it's poetry from Dante to Milton, or whether it's art, Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel or something, you cannot, Handel's Messiah, music, right, with your field. I mean,
Leonardo,
it's everywhere. Yeah.
Palestrina, Bach, yeah, the list goes on.
It's just on and on and on and on and on. How many, you can't even understand oratorios, Bach and Handel, without understanding the Bible a little bit, right? So you're right. To be an educated person, you have to have some background in this. You have to have some awareness of the Bible. And so obviously it's an important part of an education. There are, in the King James, just say it, I myself am a critic of Christianity. I wrote a book about it. I'm not a big fan of religion. I'm not a big fan of the Bible as philosophy or history, as I think I've made that clear. Nonetheless, I myself find certain parts of the King James translation to be beautiful poetry. There's no doubt about it. There's the good, bad. We were talking about the lovely erotic poetry in Song of Solomon, right? And then on the other side, you've got these horrible denunciations, these anti-sex puritanical mentality as well. You've got, the Bible is a mixed bag, let me put it that way, across the board on a number of subjects. There are some wonderful moments where you might even agree philosophically with something. It comes to mind that Ayn Rand used in Love Letters. Her heroine in the film Love Letters quotes the Bible, "For what should it profit a man if he should gain the whole world but lose his own soul?" And she says it, and I think she's speaking for Ayn Rand when the heroine says, "That's my favorite line from the Bible." And I think Ayn Rand, really, that was her favorite line from the Bible. What should it profit a man if he should gain the whole world but lose his own soul?
There's a lot of beautiful quotable poetry in the King James translation. Even if it may not be strictly philologically correct, it's still memorable and recitable.
The Gospel of Luke's nativity story, I mean, it's so famous. Peace on earth, goodwill toward men, being symbolized with the birth of a baby. I mean, and they draw out that poetic metaphor in such a lovely way that it really has left a immortal stamp on the aesthetic mind of the West, hasn't it? And as we were saying, you really can't understand Western civilization without some familiarity with the Bible on many levels, as poetry, as philosophy, as history, as an influence on other artists and other philosophy. And how would you understand, for example, the 16th century, in Europe, the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation? How would you understand any of that? How would you understand, in effect, the full motivation of the Spaniards in colonizing the New World? How would you know? Well, they have financial motivation, but also had a religious motivation. They're out there to convert the natives to Catholicism. You can't really understand history without understanding the role that religion and Christianity played. And for that, the Bible is a necessary resource. So it should be taught. It should be taught like other literature is taught. I don't think it's as benevolent, say, as Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. I mean, there's some strange primitive stuff there as well that I know we wouldn't agree with as objectivists. But if you consider the sense of life and the secular orientation of, say, Homer versus the Hebrew or Christian Bible, I'm preferring Homer. I'm preferring Homer. There's wonderful scenes in Homer. Odysseus, for example, he wins a battle, and two men who are survivors on the enemy side beg him for mercy and to spare their lives. One is a priest, one is a poet. Odysseus kills the priest and spares the life of the poet. And I think that tells you a lot about Homer and the Greeks in a good way. When Odysseus goes to the underworld, there is an afterlife in Homer, but he goes to the underworld and he sees the ghost of his mother and he tries to hug his mother, but poof, goes right through her because she's just a phantom. He can't even hug his mother. It's not a good thing, the afterlife. He talks to Achilles, who is the coolest, best warrior in the Trojan War. And Odysseus says, must be really cool to be the top ghost here in Hades. And Achilles says, no, my friend, it's terrible here. I'd rather be a slave on earth than be king of the dead here in the underworld. I think all those things tell you something about the secular, this worldly orientation of the Greeks, even when they're being religious, versus, say, the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Bible.
Well, I'm not aware that anyone has tried banning Homer so far, at least.
So far.
I can't resist interjecting. The reaction of the Republican, Ken Ivory, I believe is his name, who supported or who wrote this bill about sensitive materials in the school. So his reaction to the banning of the Bible, at first he thought it was just a hoax or that it was some kind of a parody. But then when he finally accepted it, he said, well, you can actually see him interviewed in the news. He said, well, the proper way to read the Bible is with the whole family sitting together around the hearth. That's what he's not protesting the way you would expect. He said, yeah, the proper place for reading the Bible is with the family sitting around the hearth. What do we make of that?
He realizes that there are parts of the Bible which are, I mean, how will you explain the masturbation depictions in the Tanakh? How do you explain the sexual situations that often come up in the Tanakh? He's aware that the Bible is filled. Yeah, I think there's an honest admission on his part there, in effect, that it doesn't belong in schools and young children, and from his perspective, even his Bible doesn't, but that it can be taught, should be taught, but in a way in which the parent can explain to the child and give it context at an age-appropriate time. Okay, I think I agree with him there. I think the Bible, you shouldn't just throw the Bible at a small child because it could be misunderstood or traumatizing even. Frankly, I would want my child to be taught, if they're going to read the Bible, to have some context there. And I think that's what he's admitting, in effect. The education belongs in the home. Yes.
Yeah, but okay, speaking of the home, so the Bible is deemed too vulgar and too violent for children, but what are these children being exposed to when they're at home? Probably at home, they're watching Saw, they're watching the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and how exactly does the King James Bible compare with that? So isn't there a little bit of hypocrisy here?
Well, and you think about the accessibility today. I mean, when I was young, the accessibility of hardcore pornography was quite different than it is today with the internet. Today, younger and younger children are being exposed to very sexually explicit material, or are able to access at least very explicit material. So you make a really good point. In ordinary films, there's horrific violence. There are very many cases of morally dubious situations that would require context if you're trying to educate a child. So you make a really good point there. If they're going to ban the Bible, then there's a whole bunch of other things that, if the left is, see, they're not really being principled, are they? They're saying, yeah, you want to ban the books that are sexually explicit? Well, how about the Bible? But obviously the motive, their real motive isn't to ban these books. They want those books in, and they want conservatives in Utah to realize your Bible's just as bad as the books you're wanting to ban. That's sort of the message they want to get across. Nonetheless, it's not principled in the sense that they are getting a book banned. If they were taking a principled position against book banning, they would say, no, the Bible should stay, and so should these other books that you regard as offensive, if they were going to take a consistent and principled position, which they're clearly not. But it's an interesting test case they created, at least, in going for it, in saying, well, how about the Bible? If you're going to ban other books, surely the Bible has got all kinds of sex and violence as well. I mean, as I say, compared to 50 Shades of Grey, 50 Shades of Grey's got nothing on, or Harold Robbins or Susan Collins or whatever the sexually explicit words are. I mean, there are no pictures in the Bible, right? It's not like there are images of sex, which are so available nowadays for young people. On the other hand, it was a clever way, let me put it this way, of bringing attention to the way in which books are being banned in Utah, but not a principled one, I guess is the way I'd put it.
I agree. Shall we check in with our producer, Daniel, and see if there are any super chats at the moment?
We have a super sticker from Jonathan. Thank you so much. And also a super chat from Catherine. She says, banning and altering books, always a red flag for me.
Oh, I can't agree more. And of course, we've been hearing this from leading objectivists for decades, from Dr. Peikoff, Dr. Binswanger. Censorship is always the first step on the road to any kind of tyranny. As long as we can argue, persuade, express ideas, there's still hope for the future. When certain ideas are deemed out of bounds, when certain ideas in the form of books are out of bounds, that's the first step towards dictatorship.
Absolutely. Someone would ask me where would I draw the line in terms of taking arms and wanting a revolution and wanting to actually fight my government. If my government makes peaceful change impossible, and the first condition of that is free speech, then of course there is nothing to do but use force, because they have said the only means of persuasion and peaceful change is now unlawful. So if you impose a censorship, I mean a real censorship, that is one of the great tripwires for me that would say, no, it's time to take up arms against your government and rebel against it. The idea that ideas are the dangerous thing is wrong. If you want a bad idea to get dismissed, make sure it gets free speech. Make sure it gets a platform. Give it a soapbox, the loudest megaphone you can. People like John Stuart Mill on Liberty made that exact argument, and I think he's exactly right. The best thing to happen to the truth is to allow falsehood free speech, and as big an audience as they can get. Frankly, I wouldn't want anything less. Now, of course, I'm not advocating that we let flat earthers, or astrology advocates have a TV show every night so that we get the bad idea up front. No. Some ideas we leave in the past, but if it's a currently controversial idea, absolutely give your enemy all the hearing that he needs, frankly, and don't be afraid of that. That is what's really going to sink the idea at the end of the day. Because it's only understanding that can sink it. Only understanding can sink a bad idea. The suppression of the bad idea is not the understanding that's going to be required to get around it, get past it.
And how does the suppression of bad idea always begin? Well, we have to protect the children, don't we? They're the most vulnerable, the most impressionable. That's how censorship always starts. That's why we really need to pay attention to what's going on in the schools. The banning of, as our friend said, the banning of books in schools is a huge red flag, because that's going to lead to all sorts of other bans and problems in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. The people who run libraries should be out to include more books. Think about it. If you're a librarian, what's your goal in life? Is to have as many books there available for your customers, or is it to have the select books that are appropriate for people to read? No. A librarian would want to be as inclusive, I think, and I think that would be the desire of any responsible librarian is to be as inclusive. Now, you can't include everything. Obviously, you can't include every book that's ever been published. So you have to have some discrimination in terms of what's important, what's more valuable, what's more influential, less influential. And no matter how bad I think the Bible is, as you pointed out, it's so powerfully influential, you can't even discuss history or art or anything else without some context of the Bible. So however bad I think the Bible is, it should be included because of its importance and influence. And as I say, you can't include every book in a library. So you do have to have some sort of discrimination, some kind of standards. But on the other hand, all other things being equal, ceteris paribus, you would want to include as much literature as possible in your library, it would seem to me. Now, altering books, that's just obscenity. It's just people coming around altering Dr. Seuss or Roald Dahl or Mark Twain. That is obscenity. That is the corruption of literature. That is putting a classical facade on Howard O'Rourke's magnificent skyscraper. Whatever you think of Dr. Seuss or Roald Dahl, it is a corruption, a perversion of the original work. Keep your filthy hands off classic literature, even children's literature. Thank you very much. If you don't like it, write your own goddamn book. Thank you. Yeah, that really bothers me, is the alteration of classics. When you say banning, as I say, at some level, you can't include every book in your library. If you had infinite resources, you'd have millions and millions in every single book and they'd all be equally displayed, but that's not possible, is it? So some kind of discrimination has to occur. That's why it has to be in private hands, why the government can never be the ones filtering and making these decisions. What books do I include in my library? That's inherently going to involve philosophy of value judgment. That's going to be government-sponsored philosophy that will necessarily offend one group of parents and please another group of parents. It's the nature of public education. I'm afraid that's where the real problem is. I mean, if I bought a book by Dr. Seuss and I wanted to take a magic marker and scratch out certain things from my copy of Dr. Seuss, I have every right, of course, to do that. But when it comes to what I'm going to show children to be Dr. Seuss or Roald Dahl or Mark Twain, no, you're changing the material. You're lying, in effect. You're lying. You're almost defeating the purpose of using it as an educational tool, in my view. That's how bad it is, in my view.
Absolutely. Now, viewers of this channel will readily accept that the long-term solution would be a free market in education, where parents can choose where their children should be educated, how they should be educated, by what means, using what kind of resources. But until we achieve that utopian future, what can we do now? What's the way now to respond in a principled way to any calls to ban books?
As I say, it's inherent, the problem. It's an unresolvable problem so long as it is public education. Now, if public education has to be watered down and neutral, then to that extent, we're also depriving it of educational quality. That is to say, if I'm not challenging the student with challenging ideas that might be offensive to one group of parents or another, I might be failing as an educator just on that score. So I think it is hard to get around the inherent problem of public education. But if I were a public educator, I would include everything and I would not alter anything. I would include everything that had educational value, let me put it that way. So if I said, I'm going to teach Dr. Seuss or use it, I wouldn't alter Dr. Seuss. Either use Dr. Seuss or say, I'm not using Dr. Seuss. Don't change Dr. Seuss. Also, if it's simply availability of the book and it's a book of importance like the Bible, you include it. You include it in your library. It's a book of importance. Now, whether you use it to teach the kids or not, and when the kid is reading it, I mean, the parents have got to be on the ball here and be good parents too, and know what their kids are reading. That's part of being a responsible parent. So if I were, as I say, coming back around, if I were, say, a librarian at a public school, I would opt for inclusion. And I certainly would not censor within a book the content of a book. I think all of that's obscene.
You brought up a very important point, which is the standard for inclusion of books in libraries. It should be it should be merit. It should be quality, the importance of the book, the value of the book, not the the way diversity and inclusion are used today. Well, of course, we have to have something from underrepresented minorities. No, it's the quality. Certainly if there's something there that's a quality and a permanent value, yes, absolutely included. But just merely saying, well, we have to represent, we have to include underrepresented voices. No, that by itself is not an appropriate standard.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to include it just because someone belongs to a unusual group, you've now lost all standards altogether. And so anything by a person who is, a purple Martian, we have to include purple Martians. And this is purple Martian literature, but that doesn't make purple Martian literature any educational value. You're absolutely right about that as well. So, and they obviously do have limited resources, and the library is only so big. So you have to you have to discriminate and make decisions, calls about what you're going to include and what you're not going to include. And that should be done on the basis of the educational value and quality of the literature. Absolutely. But again, I, even as an objectivist, would be hesitant to, in a public school setting, if it was the Van Damme Academy or something, yes, of course, we're going to filter it with all of our values and stuff. But if I were a public educator, I would feel uncomfortable about promoting objectivism in effect, even implicitly by the way I'm educating a child. Is this right? Are the parents in agreement with this? I at least have some resistance, some mores that would tell me the parents need to be involved in this decision about the moral education or what book we read next at this age. And if the parents aren't involved in that decision, there's something inherently wrong and unavoidably inherently wrong in my view. So it is a really horrible hatched situation, sort of almost like a lifeboat situation, to say, Jim, you're now in public education. What do you do with the books there? It was like what Ludwig von Mises said. What would you do if you were made the economic dictator of the country? Quit. It's John Galt. What does he say? What would you do? Quit. Right? I think that's the appropriate response when someone says, what ideas would you force down certain children's throats? I'm opposed to that. Parents are the ones who should be monitoring, guiding, and controlling that exclusively, in my mind. And that is more important. I'm going to say this. The parental control is more important, or let me put it negatively. Getting the government out of it is more important than anything else. The content, it is true that the content, of course, obviously is what matters, but I would rather have some dubious content and have the government out. I think that would be a much healthier situation, if that makes sense.
Yes, I agree completely. Let's check in with Daniel one more time. Daniel, do we have any final super chats or any announcements for today?
No more super chats, but coming up at 7 p.m. UK time, it's the Fountainhead Book Club for ARC UK members, and the session will also be live streamed to our YouTube members. You can find the link to the live stream in the chat.
Excellent. James, this has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for offering your insights and picking apart the implications of this issue. Do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Not really, thank you. These conversations are always great, sir. I really enjoy them a lot. And I have to say, I agree with Catherine, I agree with you. Banning books is a red flag. Changing books is a red flag. We shouldn't be afraid of books, shouldn't be afraid of words, we shouldn't be afraid of knowledge, even when we disagree with it. It's an educational opportunity, not a corruption, if treated properly.
Well, I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much, James, as always, for your insights. Thank you to our viewers and supporters of the ARC UK channel. And with that, I wish you all the best of premises. See you next time.